The first shop then was Bainey's Dairy. Again, another dairy. Cruikshank's Dairy was only about 50 yards up the road. Willie Bain went round with his horse and cart delivering milk, and again it was a matter of people buying a pint, 2 pints, just enough to do them. Just further in, this was a chemist shop, built as a chemist shop, became an office for a lawyer for a while, and then came back into a chemist shop before becoming a house. Across the road from that was this area, always referred to by us oldies as the Comedy. The building on the left was the tea rooms run by Mrs. McLennan. It had been started by a widow coming back from Australia. She'd been in South Africa, and she and her husband went to Australia. He drowned in Sydney Harbour, and the people there subscribed enough to get her home to Lossie. She opened that and ran it for about 20 years before it was taken over by Mrs. McLennan, who closed it when she moved up to the Laverick Bank. Alec Cormack's house contained on the left-hand side there by the red car a barber shop. Davy Youngson, father of Willie, who was father of Willie, who still cuts hair in Lossie. I had a haircut in there at the age of about 6, I would think. Just along from that, this was a sub-post office. I used to take down the Northern Scot carefully wrapped to send out to my Uncle Willie in California, 206 Diamond Street, Redondo Beach, California. I used to write USA. Mrs. Neves stood halfway down the shop with her hands folded, watching everything that was going on, and the serving was done by Charlie, and she watched him like a hawk. I didn't know why at the time, but I discovered later that Charlie had lost their house in a card game, and that's the house that he lost. I've often wondered what he said when he went home. Just below that, this house was Jim Mitchell. Jim was a tailor, and in those days people still had suits made for them to go and be measured and have a Sunday suit made. His wife ran a little haberdashery, and I was sent down, I can remember it to this day, I was sent down to get 2 yards of knicker elastic, blacker fronted, having to say knicker. I don't know how I survived. Opposite Charlie Neves was Alexander's, probably the most successful business in Lossie. Bakers had 3 shops and 4 or 5 vans and delivered all over the town and in the country areas, and eventually the upstairs was converted into a tea room by Maggie Alexander, Mrs. Ross, and that was successful until she gave up, and then they were used by other shopkeepers, never very successfully, until they sold it and converted it all to housing. This was Meldrum's house, and the right-hand part of it was, when I was young, occupied by Clemente Rizza. He had an ice cream parlour with seating and in booths and things like that. He gave up the ownership or the running of that. He presumably rented it. And it was taken over by Davy Youngson, moved along the street, and then eventually by Willie Youngson, who ran it for many years until he retired. Rizza moved along the street and bought the house and a half, and the half was converted into a shop, which he ran quite successfully. He was deported to the Isle of Man during the war and came back and ran the shop. Eventually it was run by his son Louis, and then by David Ross as a grocery shop. Murray's the bakers in Fochabers had shops in Elgin and Lossie, and we used to go along there to buy wine biscuits, wineys. What you did was you bought your softies in Alexander's, you bought your wineys in Murray's, and if you wanted fancy biscuits, fancy cakes we would call them now, you went round the corner to Johnny Anderson. We'll come to Johnny's later. Along the street there was this white-fronted building This was Sutherland, the jewellers. Alan Sutherland was a great supporter of the tennis. His daughter was a keen tennis player. It was sold to the TSB, Trustee Savings Bank, which was the scene of a robbery in 1994 when a man came in and went off with several £1,000s. It was thought that he was a serviceman who was being posted, and he was never caught. Next door was Jim Kay, the radio mechanic and television eventually, and his wife took over to run a hairdresser there. She'd had one further down the street earlier. Oh, I remember this one. During the war, we used to have trouble getting our shoes repaired. Presumably the leather was all being used by the army to make tackety boots for the soldiers. This was a Mr. Ross. I didn't know he was called Mr. Ross. When you took your shoes down, he would say, "Come back next week." So you'd go back next week and ask for the shoes, and he'd say, "Hardly done, come back at midnight." And he was known as Hardly Done all the time that he was there. He would have a mouthful of tacks, incidentally. That was where he held them waiting use. That was a tea room for a short time. I was never in it because who needs to go to a tea rooms in their own town? And next one down with a white window there, that was George McBain. That was a very important place because George did bicycles. He did radio, and you could get your batteries charged there, or accumulators charged there. But more important than that, he sold fish hooks, so that we would buy a fish hook and get a length of twine and tie it on there and go down to catch gerrachs. I don't think I was ever very good at catching gerrachs, and I don't think I was ever convinced that it was worth worrying about, because eventually the gows got the gerrachs. Up to Dunbar Street, there are very few shops in Dunbar Street. This one was Mrs. Smith, Jim Smith's mother, and I never went into it. I don't think I even went to try and get fags there. The building in the centre was the original telephone exchange in Lossie, and it was replaced by the brand new telephone exchange in 1937. And we saw it and we looked at it and we thought it was very impressive, and it never occurred to me that we would ever have a telephone. In fact, there wasn't a telephone in our house until I think the 1960s probably, when men started going to the West Coast, and then telephones became very, very useful. So that was the information revolution of our day. In James Street, this was Robbie Thompson, the baker. Robbie was a quiet, gentle man, lovely man. He'd been widowed, and he and his daughter Florence ran this for years. And he was a high-class baker, it says here, and confectioner. The shop was never great on hygiene. Robbie worked down at the fish sheds, and it was always alleged that he tramped the dough in his bare feet, coming straight from the fish sheds, and that's what gave his stuff the flavour. His rolls were, his morning rolls, buttery rolls, were very tasty, very crisp, and they were known as Robbie Thompson's toenails. There's Robbie with the horse, Buller. He used to go around delivering, and if people didn't have money, he would give them a loaf and say, "Just pay me when you can." Next was the garage, Robbie's garage, which had petrol pumps and so on. And during the war, the Home Guards, the local defence volunteers, Dad's Army, they became eventually, stored their materials in there, but that's now a residence as well. So across the road from Robbie Thompson's was this shop, which had a label on it saying John MacLeod, motor agent. And I only ever knew it as Jockey Gingy. It was years later before I discovered that his hair had been ginger when he had hair, and his name actually was John MacLeod. Building on the left, that was McWilliam the tailor. Again, tailors were in a great supply and have now totally vanished. The building in the back was owned by Libby Winter, and she sold pies. She made pies and sold pies. Don't know anything about it because I never actually bought a pie from her.